So this is a paper, the title, Stress Testing in Community Banks, which is a little bit of a non sequitur because we know that community banks aren't mandated to do stress tests. So why am I talking about stress testing with community banks? Well, partly because of my colleague Joe Fairchild, who's a risk manager at Bank of America and has been one of the hundreds and hundreds of folks at Bank of America involved in their bottom-up stress testing efforts over time, and he's also teaches in our MBA programs at Kansas. So we don't require community banks to do stress tests. The general idea, we talked about this a little bit before, unless there's a tremendous amount of herding going on in the industry. The community banks, they're resolvable. The FDIC has gotten much better at this over time, proven that they can resolve without very many deleterious effects, small and medium-sized banks, so there's no systemic consequences here. For community banks, certainly having to do stress tests or not having to do stress tests is a nice thing. It avoids regulatory burden, and the folks who work at community banks, even mid-sized, large community banks, middle-sized banks, the expertise, the on-staff expertise to do this kind of testing doesn't exist, right? And indeed not. So why are we writing this paper? We think community banks should want to know, if it's possible for them to know, how their banks would hold up if we had another severe economic shock. And that's what Joe and I are doing this paper for. We do make some small academic and regulatory, we think, contributions to this type of stress testing model. But what we're really after here is creating a tool that may give community banks some information about how they would be affected under different kinds of macroeconomic stress. So we don't start from scratch. We adopt a model that was developed at the New York Fed by Bev Hurdle, who's the director of research at New York now, and her extremely talented staff. They call it the CLASS model, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but they've estimated this model for the largest 200 banks in the United States, and this is a different kind of model than a bottom-up kind of stress testing model. A bottom-up stress testing model is based on data from one bank, and the data of that bank for individual credits is used to create a model that's parameterized based on only information from that bank. And then that model is used to stress the bank under certain conditions. This model is a top-down model, and as you see, Bev and her colleagues estimated this for the largest 200 U.S. banks. So a top-down model starts with a set of banks, estimates general tendencies among those banks. So the model is based on data from all the banks, but you get one set of parameters for the whole set of banks. So that's a top-down model. And then you can use that model by putting in data for any one of those banks, project what one of those banks would do in a crisis based on general tendencies in the data. So it's a little bit different kind of a model. We take the bank and we take the model and we make a few adjustments to it. I won't go into details here, but I will tell you because this question is going to come up. We, rather than use just macroeconomic variables to stress the banks in this model, we also take it to the state level economic indicators in our stress tests because community banks obviously are not just sensitive to the national macro aggregates during a recession, but also to how good or poorly their state economies are doing. So that's one way we augment the model. But we estimate the model for 4 different size classes of banks, and then we use the model to stress U.S. community banks under the 2 current Federal Reserve stress testing scenarios, the adverse supervisory and the severe adverse supervisory stress scenario. And we plan to update the model annually going forward, and to make bank-specific stress test results, not bank-specific models, bank-specific results from this model available to individual community banks upon request. So very quickly, you want to know what the model looks like. Well, it's an income statement, basically. There's 16 lines on this particular income statement, and each one of these corresponds to a regression equation. How do we estimate the model? We have data from 100 quarters, 1991 through 2015. We estimate each of those lines as a separate regression. What you see there, 1 through 16, those are the dependent variables in the regressions. Each regression includes bank-specific variables and also macroeconomic variables that correspond to the conditions in the Federal Reserve's stress test scenarios. And we use a pooled panel approach with geographic fixed effects. So we estimate that, basically you can think, for a panel of banks over time. And once we have the parameters of that model, and this is what the parameters will tell us. Usefully, the parameters of the model will tell us how every one of those 16 lines changes for banks or a given bank as the macroeconomic conditions change. So once we have that model estimated, we use it we estimate it through 2015, and we project the bank capital for the next 3 years. How do we do that? We use the very final observation, the last quarter of 2015, and also the first quarter of 2016 for the Fed's stress scenario. And then using bank-specific information, like how much capital they have, what their balance sheets and income statements look like, and then and how much stress is placed on the economy and the banks in the economy based on the Federal Reserve stress scenario, we project the values for all 16 of these income statement items for each bank in the first quarter of 2016. You add them all up and you get the expected pre-tax income for each bank for that first quarter of 2016 when they're under stress. We apply a tax rate, we adjust equity and loan charge-offs, and then we iterate again for quarter after quarter after quarter after quarter, all the way through the Federal Reserve's stress scenarios. At the end of that, we find out how much capital each of these banks has left, according to our model. We've actually estimated for these 4 different data subsamples. Today, we'll focus mainly on these banks, large community banks and small community banks. As I said, we project capital for each of the banks in our data going forward based on 2015 data, moving forward through the stress scenarios for the next 3 years. Well, here's the results we got for what the distribution of banks, large community banks, so these are community banks with more than 500 million in assets, where their Tier 1 risk-based capital ratio would end up at the end of this stress scenario. And you notice none of them become insolvent. In fact, none of them even become severely undercapitalized. And we said, there's something wrong with our model. This can't possibly be true. We thought, well, what's going on? Well, there's why are so few banks projected by our model to be insolvent in 2018? Well, there's 4 reasons, and we can correct these. And I'm doing this correction because I think there's value in explaining this. Number 1, there's extreme survivor bias in our sample. The only community banks left in 2015 are those that basically made it through the last crisis, right? So they're going to be stronger for any stress scenario. They're not going to perform as poorly as the banks did in 2007 and 2008 and 2009. Okay. Our stress scenarios, for technical reasons, are only 9 quarters long, as we know, looking back at the last crisis, banks were still failing after 3 or 4 or 5 years after the crisis started. Number 3, our projections are based on expected outcomes. We do know in the real world, some banks will perform better than expected, some banks will perform worse than expected, so in the real world we get some more failures. But the big thing is number 4, which we can correct for. Since the crisis, regulators have made banks hold more capital. So in any given stress scenario, these banks are going to perform better. Here's what we can see. The top line shows for smaller banks. The bottom line shows for larger banks, the Tier 1 risk-based ratios over time. And you can see that in 2015, when we're doing our stress tests, banks were holding substantially more capital than they were prior to and during the crisis. So we correct for this. We rerun our simulation, we rerun our projections, assuming that the banks were still holding only the amount of capital that they'd been holding at the beginning of the financial crisis. And these are the orange lines. You see the distribution now becomes more realistic. We find out that essentially the financial crisis reran, and that's what the severely adverse scenario is aimed at modeling, a shock scenario similar to what we went through 10 years ago. If that had happened again, about 4% of the large community banks in our sample would have become insolvent. Now, during the financial crisis, about 7% of community banks became insolvent. So this looks like a good number. This number makes sense. About 18% would become severely undercapitalized. About half become significantly undercapitalized, and then some would do better than this. So this is how our model performs for the large community banks in the sample. And remember, this is like the shock of all shocks. This is the mother of all shocks, right? Since we've been doing these kind of things. So this kind of outcome isn't too surprising. I wouldn't say this is too bad. Rerun the projections for the small community banks, and we don't see nearly as many failures, right? Only a few. What do we make of this? These are small banks, $50 million to $500 million. Well, we all know you guys hold lots and lots of capital. I mean, this is probably the answer here. So, a summary of our findings. Number one, the community banking sector is now substantially less exposed to macroeconomic shocks than before the crisis, because when we run these models using 2015 capital, we get very few failures. Okay. Few projected insolvencies, higher capital ratios, surviving banks are battle tested to some extent. Now, I guess Greg and Alan once wrote a paper on the generational effects of bank examiners, and that after a generation goes by, the new examiners have forgotten what happened during the last generation. So we're only 10 years away from the most recent unpleasant times. Hopefully we don't forget the same way. Okay, second bullet. However, individual community banks are still exposed to large, though largely non-fatal losses should a shock similar to the financial crisis occur again. Here's another way to look at it, other data which I didn't typically show you. Large community banks, given current equity levels, we'd expect 79% to drop below adequately capitalized if this scenario repeated itself. So that's serious. Very few insolvencies, however, still substantial losses. For small community banks, we get much more robust results for the banks. We only expect 18% to drop below adequately capitalized should this scenario rerun itself. Final slide here. As I said at the beginning, Joe and I are trying to outreach to the community banking sector here. That's the real reason for doing this. I invite you to visit our website for the Center for Banking Excellence at Kansas. If you can't remember this HTTPS address, just go to the KU website and type in centers. It'll get you there. At the website, you can find these presentation slides. You can also find the full-length technical paper. In addition, research analysis and commentary on the banking industry. But also, now we're still working this out, but we would like to engage with you about how we can provide, when I say customized, this isn't a model estimated for one of your banks or another of your banks, but customized results and analysis of how your bank comes out of our model, just because we think you guys deserve to know. So I'll stop there, and I hope to talk to you guys going forward. Thanks.